I think that's the last of them. Whew. Oh. How many were they? What are you doing? What does it look like I'm doing? I'm digging in. Trust me, this is going to be really important very soon. Yeah, okay. Oh, Jesus.
The short magazine Lee-Enfield, Musketry of 1914, Part 2. In this video, we'll discuss preliminary musketry training, training aids, targetry, and the use of miniature and 30 yards training ranges. Musketry of 1914 was governed by the 2 volumes of the Musketry Regulations. Part 1 covered theory, marksmanship skills, and the associated drills needed to operate the weapon. It also included all the details of teaching and subsequent testing of these skills, culminating in the soldier's annual qualification. Part 2 contained more technical information on the setup and construction of ranges, targetry, and the specs and use of appliances or training aids. As mentioned, after the Boer War, musketry became increasingly more important in the soldier's life. In fact, part of his pay was based on how well he could shoot. These volumes, incidentally, also contained similar information for machine guns, the pistol, and even early hand grenades. The regimen of training was comprehensive, even exhaustive, yet it wasn't geared towards churning out top-tier match shooters. It was, however, geared towards producing excellent effects on the battlefield. If we examine the training material from 2 angles, we might say it dealt with the active side of musketry, shooting, hitting targets in all manner of weather and description, directing the fire of a group to achieve certain goals, etc. It also incorporated the passive side of musketry, ensuring the shooter would survive to use his weapon. To this end, multiple fire positions were taught, each for use in close conjunction with different types of cover, walls, trenches, and the like. This was a fundamental change from the musketry of the 19th century, and was a direct result of the Boer War. There was also a great deal of time spent in the theory of shooting. Trajectories, aiming considerations, effects of ground on fire and such. As was mentioned, the School of Musketry at Hythe was the epicenter for Army musketry, and there were taught officers and NCOs, who then would be able to act as regimental instructors in their own battalions and regiments. This is how the art of musketry was propagated throughout the Army. As with most complex subjects, the study and practice of musketry began with the teaching and mastery of preliminary training. Men were taught about their weapons in great detail. This would invariably begin with learning the parts and characteristics of the rifle, external and internal. Care and maintenance would follow with the use of the various cleaning methods and tools available. The relative simplicity of bolt-action repeating rifles meant that cleaning in particular was quite simple. There was, however, one aspect that was of critical importance. Although cordite, the propellant in all service cartridges, wasn't chemically harmful to the bore, the composition of the compound used in the primer was. Firing left salts in the bore, and these would cause rust and corrosion to quickly form if left unattended for long. The remedy for this was simple: water. 4 to 6 pints of boiling water were prescribed to be poured down the barrel, taking care not to flood the body or the magazine. This was achieved by the use of a special funnel, which featured a bent spout, that would deliver the water to the bore while being outside the body of the rifle. The water was very simply poured down the barrel, dissolving the salts and nullifying their corrosive properties. Subsequent steps involved a tool that was known as a pull-through, with a weight at one end and a loop at the other woven into the string. Wire gauze could be attached, and with an amount of oil from the bottle, both of which were kept in the butt trap of the rifle, were pulled the length of the barrel to loosen fouling. Flannelette 4x2s were then used to wipe the bore, after which a coat of oil was applied for preservation. Once the theory and basic information had been covered, handling of the rifle, practical skills, became the focus. Perhaps most prominent were the various positions used when shooting. The load position was used to achieve this action. It had variations for most positions, including that used when behind cover. Fire positions used for actual shooting were as follows. The standing, a fairly conventional affair, for use over high cover or obstacles. Note the fact that the sling is not used in any way, being barred in military shooting. The kneeling position was used for moderately high cover. Note the key element of the elbow-to-knee contact for stability of the rifle. The prone or lying position was for low or non-existent cover, perhaps the most important position, as it was here where the man would achieve his best results in shooting, and also this was the position used for most of his qualification practices. The sitting position was also taught for the use on forward slopes. Note the elbow-to-knee contact with both elbows for support of the rifle. These positions were taught with a close relation to the use of cover, shooting around a wall, tree, or embankment. Once the man could hold his rifle properly, he learned how to aim it effectively. This was a comprehensive learning process, and to that end, training aids were developed to teach and correct the men on how to do it. There were two styles of aiming rest used for instruction. One type consisted of a large wooden ball with a groove and clamp to fix the rifle on a given line. From this, a man could be shown how to aim and demonstrate proficiency with a rock-steady rifle. Another type featured a clamping system mounted on a tripod, used for the same purpose. In order to teach sight alignment, there was a tool known as an aim teacher. It was an aperture mounted on a series of adjustable arms that clamped to the butt. By setting it a certain way, the instructor could demonstrate proper sight alignment to recruits. The aim corrector was a tool devised to allow two men to look down the same set of sights at the same time. The aim corrector held a piece of glass that was angled so as to produce a prismatic effect. By the use of this device, the instructor could assess the pupil's aim and, if necessary, coach him on to the target. Used for checking rapid aiming skills, the eye disc was another important tool. With a simple target printed on one side and a small hole at its center, the instructor was able to have the pupil aim directly at the hole, and then by viewing through it, check to see if he was aiming correctly after working the bolt. After holding and aiming, the skills necessary to fire the rifle were dealt with. This involved proper breathing, correct trigger manipulation, and a good, solid follow-through. But firing was not just an individual skill, and it was incorporated into the greater topic of fire discipline. Men did not simply shoot at what they felt like on the battlefield, and they would follow orders that indicated what to shoot at and how. There were many skills involved in the former, not the least of which was how to judge distance. Huge amounts of time were spent teaching, learning, and practicing this vital skill. There were even competitions held for this skill to judge proficiency. Recognition of natural features and pointed aim on them also figured prominently. The second aspect, or how to shoot, involved essentially three types of engagement. Deliberate fire, during which the man took the time required to achieve his best aim. This typically brought a rate of between 3 and 6 rounds a minute. Rapid fire, in which the man fired at his best rate. According to the book, this was between 12 and 15 rounds a minute. And what was known as snap shooting, where the man waited, watching a given area, with targets hidden from view. When the target did appear, it was then engaged in the most timely fashion. The time allotted in training was 4 seconds to achieve this. These two aspects were combined into what was known as a fire order. This short, brief battlefield instruction contained all the necessary information to have a man or group of men engage a target. It included a range with which to set the sights, an indication to a body of enemy or an object at which to shoot, and the type of engagement to be used. This took the form of a couple of concise words of command. The command fire, which was to indicate deliberate fire, rapid fire, whose meaning would appear to be rather self-evident, and although there was no specific command in the manual to indicate snap shooting, it did make mention of what might be termed anticipatory orders. These would set up the engagement in rate of fire and location before the appearance of the enemy.
200, slightly left, enemy on top of hill. Fire! 200, 1/4 right, large rock, enemy at base, 5 rounds, rapid, fire! 1200, slightly right, group of trees, enemy at base. When they break cover and cross that field, crossing right to left, 10 rounds, rapid fire.
The mastery of all these skills mentioned was importantly paired often with the use of dummy rounds, also known as drill rounds. Pre-war, these would have been either the Mark III or the Mark IV, both with wooden, red painted bullets. My drill rounds date from late war or post-war, and are of a couple of different marks. One with a specially constructed fluted casing, and another with a service casing. Of course, in all cases, there is no propellant or primer. The use of these was critical in developing the skills of rapid loading, rapid aiming, and cycling the bolt. In fact, these skills were so important that drills were dedicated to simply charging and unloading the magazine. 5-round chargers were placed in the magazine repeatedly. The goal here was to produce muscle memory so that the man would charge his rifle in the most efficient and speedy way. This was practiced in multiple positions, the most important of which was of course the prone. This position also required the most practice as it was the most difficult. In all cases, the weapon was unloaded in the textbook way, by simply moving the bolt back and forth without closing it. The extractor gripped the rim of the rounds, and they were ejected one after the other. As was mentioned, the use of dummy rounds was incorporated into other training. Dummy rounds could be used to practice deliberate fire, in the case of this example. This would have been practiced with the use of an eye disc, an aim corrector, or simply an aiming mark, painted on the barrack wall. Perhaps most importantly, dummy rounds were used to practice rapid fire techniques. Rapid loading, rapid aiming, and rapid firing. While certainly not the be-all end-all, that of course being live shooting with proper time constraints, dummy rounds, however, did play an important role in the teaching of the men. Their use would bring the men to a certain level, after which they would transition to the use of live rounds. In this example, we see dummy rounds being used to practice a 15-round rapid shoot, all done within the confines of 1 minute. Now, obviously, practicing like this is devoid of many key aspects of shooting. Namely, and most importantly, is the lack of any kind of discharge and the recoil associated with it. That said, by observing this, it's easy to see how important this kind of dry practice was to improving the musketry skills of the soldiers. Note here the smooth, efficient Lee action of the rifle. Another aspect of musketry that had advanced greatly was in the field of targetry. What had in the 19th century been of a rudimentary bullseye style, targetry became in the 20th a comprehensive array of shapes and sizes used for varying training situations. The simple bullseye target was still used, only now it was for the most basic of shooting. Once past that level, the soldier shot at almost exclusively what would be known as figure targets. The number 1 figure was that of a standing man. The number 2, a smaller version from the thigh up. The number 3 figure was that of a man kneeling. The number 4 figure was that of a man shooting prone, while the number 5 was a man shooting over high cover, such as over a wall. The number 6 figure represented a crouching man moving across one's front. In the case of the figures 4 and 5, they were used, in addition to being used by themselves, as part of a more complex pair of targets. The number 5 was used on the second-class figure target, while the number 4 on the first-class figure target. These frame targets were used during qualification practices and featured scoring rings for a more subtle assessment of shooting effectiveness. These were typically covered with 2 colors, green or brown on the lower half with gray or green on the upper. In the center, though slightly offset a bit high, was, as mentioned, placed the appropriate figure silhouette. Here's a picture of both the second-class elementary target and the second-class figure target in use on the Shorncliffe Ranges in 1915. The extra dot on the elementary bullseye is simply a mark to indicate where the round has hit. Here are 3 examples of the second-class figure target, 1 with a brown number 5, and 2 with a black. Note the difference in color of the upper and lower halves. Each, however, is acceptable according to the regulations. These targets, although used in a conventional way on a conventional range, were also used in a more tactical style of shooting, known as field firing. The figure targets could be rigged to appear and disappear as desired by range staff to test the men in snap and rapid shooting. Typically arranged on a simple pivoting frame, it was actuated by cord or light cable. They provided a powerful tool in practicing practical musketry. These could also be rigged as moving targets on a system of string and pulleys. Here we see a selection of other targets typically used for field firing, a field gun and limber, and a series of figure targets. Note the example on the right is of a 2-man machine gun crew. Clearly, targetry had come a long way from the old iron frame bullseye versions. For use on the miniature and 30 yards range, there were what were known as landscape targets. By setting the sights to a very high setting, objects could be engaged on the painting, while the rounds would hit high through a paper placed above the image. By comparing the holes to the landscape, shooting effectiveness could be assessed. Before shooting commenced, the men were put through a series of tests. These were known as Tests on Elementary Training, or TOETs. For the rifle, they were broken into 3 groups. The first group, known as the oral tests, included material on the care of ammunition and arms, ability to describe natural objects and features, and general theory questions regarding weapon performance and other details. The second group of tests were known as the inspection tests. The men were inspected as to their ability to adopt various fire positions as well as the application of fire discipline in fire direction, reaction to fire orders, and adjustment of sights. The third group of tests were known as standard tests: eyesight, recognition of targets and aiming points, judging distance, adjustment of sights, aiming and trigger pressing, aiming off, rapidity of aim, rapidity of loading, and rapidity of firing were amongst the subjects examined. Once successful completion of the TOETs had been achieved, shooting could then begin. But at first, this was conducted on the miniature or the 30 yards range. Training with subcaliber rounds was not a new concept by the early 20th century. A device known as a Morris tube had been used since the days of the Martini Henry to enable the rifle to be used on indoor ranges. This used a small, bottlenecked .23 caliber round. This device was also produced in a .22 caliber rimfire version. Proper standalone rifles in .22 caliber were produced by modifying older magazine Lee Metfords and Enfields, as well as older marks of SMLE. These rifles proved an important tool in the development of the men's musketry skills, and ranges, which were a feature in most barracks, were at times very complex. Although the 30 yards range could be used with small bore 22 caliber rifles, its use with full bore ammunition was also equally important. As mentioned before, one of the types of shooting done on the 30 yards range was that using a landscape target.
The first step in this kind of shooting was known as harmonization. By aiming at the aiming mark on the screen above, the rounds were gauged to be between the two parallel lines located at the top of the screen, thus ensuring that no matter where you aimed on the target, the rounds would hit on the screen, saving the landscape target from damage. 1200, harmonization. 3 rounds at your aiming mark. Fire! So generally I would call that harmonized. 2 of the 3 anyway are between the lines. I pulled that third one high, so I'm good with that. Again, point of aim was here, point of impact was way up here, and that's at 1200 yard sight setting. Now we can go back and shoot at an indicated target on the landscape. Our rounds will hit somewhere in this area here. And by measuring the distance from the grouping to the point of aim on the landscape, we're then able to gauge just how accurate we were in relation to this distance here. 1200. Slightly right, group of trees. Left-hand tree, enemy at base. 2 rounds, fire. Slightly left. White house with red roof. Enemy in left-hand window. 3 rounds rapid. Fire. So the 2 targets, where this is the base of this left-hand tree here, and the house with the red roof on the left. By the use of a gauge, which had the acceptable grouping marked out inside a square or circle, and an appropriate length of rod below, we can gauge to see whether or not the grouping that was shot was actually on target. Let's have a look. So by placing the tip of the rod at the base of the tree, we could see that our 2 rounds were within the gauge. Move over here to the house with the red roof, and we see the same. So by carrying on this way, men would practice their musketry skills, and the NCOs would practice their target indications and direction of fire. All in all, for a 30 yards range, for a training aid, an effective system.
This brings us to the end of part 2. As you can see, preliminary instruction in musketry was extensive. Many hours were spent in this training before the man even stepped on to the conventional range. In the next part, we'll deal with the focus of this series, the annual qualification of 1914. If you haven't been over to see an arsenal lately, first of all, go and say hello to Matthias and May, and secondly, make sure that you watch their SMLE video. It's an unbelievable episode. And if you feel as though you might like to support our channel, please go on over to our Patreon page. Thank you very much.